Welcome to Live Like an Acrobat. I'm your host, Shenea Stiletto, two-time world champion in acrobatic gymnastics and cirque artist. In this episode, I will continue my conversation with sisters Cameron Jones and Jordan Jones as they reflect on their experiences of being Black acrobats competing in acrobatic gymnastics. I will also introduce a new special guest. Please enjoy part 2 of our discussion.
Did you see other Black acrobats affected by racism or unfair treatment within the sport? Did you have encounters where you saw people treated a certain way, where you saw other Black acrobats having encounters or having experiences they shared with you that were painful?
I think the most glaring is acrobatics is a very visual sport. It's all about body type, and the athletes who tend to have bigger hips or a more stereotypical Black girl figure, I guess people would call it, it's sort of looked down upon, and people wonder why they can't just, become more uniform or lose some weight, and so I feel like that kind of where I've seen it the most. It's like the Eurocentric beauty standards really coming through.
Exactly. That's something that I've picked up on as well. And so there is that bias, and Black athletes do, you can see it very clearly. You can see it happening, and you can see how it affects Black athletes. If we're analyzing the partnering process, coaches will put together people who look the same, right? It's good for the artistry score. So the few token Black athletes on the team are all grouped together. And then you move into the case of scoring. So Cameron mentioned Black athletes tend to be curvier or more muscular. And what does that do? It disrupts the lines. So that's an artistry deduction. But a long, lean white athlete, that beautiful trio with the beautiful lines, they all match nicely. They match those Eurocentric standards. That's naturally perceived to look better. So that could lead to higher scores. Coaches might work more with the Black athletes and criticize their dance technique more because of either their body type or the way that they move, or even just that implicit bias that we carry against African American people, that they are somehow less refined or more quote-unquote ghetto. And so that really plays into this kind of culture of elitism within the sport. And so I think the issue that we have to reconcile with is that the performing arts sphere, be it acrobatics or ballet or cheerleading, it's this microcosm that's very much based around this idea of having quote-unquote the look. So these sports are very visual, and they're all about precision, technique, form, and this leads to a preference for a certain shape or a certain aesthetic. So you have a standard of beauty or a particular aesthetic that becomes synonymous with proper execution, right? So desirable artistry standards. Your appearance becomes tied to your scores or your level of proficiency at your sport. So success within all of these performing arts spheres becomes contingent on your ability to conform to a certain profile. And that just opens up the doors not just to implicit but very explicit bias against people of color, because quite often and by design, people of color don't fit those European beauty standards, or at the very least, they don't match their white majority counterparts, which again leads to it affects their scoring, their performance not being uniform.
Mm-hmm. What do you both think needs to change for Black representation in acrobatic gymnastics, and how much has changed since you were an athlete? Has there been progress? Are things different? I competed from 1996 into 2004, so the landscape within acrobatic gymnastics for Black representation is much different than it was when I competed. You could literally count us on your hands the amount of Black athletes that competed during the time that I competed with my sister in a trio. So there has been a lot of change, but we know that we still have so far to go. So what do you think that Black representation should look like, could look like, and how much has it changed even since you were both athletes?
I feel like it hasn't changed much. I think by virtue of the fact that the sport has grown, there are more Black athletes now, but I feel like the ratio is still there. There's still a clear underrepresentation of people of color, like, in the sport, and I feel like the barriers have become even more overt. In the past few years, even from when I started acro to when I finished acro, the cost of leotards skyrocketed. The standard of leotards went from you can get by with a $300 leotard to now a good one is up to $1,000. And I think that financial barrier is a big factor in the underrepresentation in the sport. And I know that with the Acrobatic Gymnastics Foundation, their goal is to help those athletes that might not have the financial opportunity, but I think the sport is so expensive. Cups are all self-funded. Leotards are expensive. Tuition for the gym is always high. So I feel like until the financial barriers are gone, I think we're going to see the same trend.
Yeah, I think that's something that I had definitely I thought was a central component, is just that very clear financial barrier, and it feeds right into that kind of elitist mentality. So you mentioned, even if a less privileged family were able to participate in the sport, there is that expectation that if you're not spending, exorbitant amounts of money on a custom-made $1,000 Leo from Russia, then you're going to be perceived differently when it comes to competitions. So I think having some form of support, like she mentioned with the Acrobatic Gymnastics Foundation, some kind of funding to make it more accessible, bringing acro gyms to communities and areas that are more representative. I think sometimes, or quite often, you might find that these acro gyms are in affluent areas or majority white areas. So there's not quite as much accessibility. So that financial aspect is definitely a big piece. In terms of improving it for the Black athletes that are already within the community, like Cameron mentioned, it can start as simple as providing more representative leotards and, making Black athletes feel like they are part of the community and they are not just a token. Being mindful of the partnering process and, not just putting all of the Black athletes together in a group. I think change also has to come in the artistry scoring and the standards. I remember there used to be a deduction. It was called math and maturity, correct, Cameron?
Yeah.
And groups would get deductions when a partner was perceived to look overweight, right? And so they took that out. So I think the same thing has to be applied for, groups shouldn't be scored necessarily by how uniform they are. So if one partner happens to be Black and the other two have to be white, that certainly shouldn't reflect their performance. It should have no bearing on their ability. Systemically implementing or integrating bias into the system and then being very deliberate in dismantling that.
I wanted to ask you, Jordan, to just repeat the last phrase that you said one more time, because we lost a bit of what you were saying before you got to your very last point, if you can remember and bring that back for us.
Sure, of course. I think, at the end I was just saying the overall thing that we need to do is we need to identify the ways in which we are implementing systemic bias into the sport, be it artistry scores or grouping or leotards or deductions or things like that. We need to actively identify it and then deliberately dismantle it and make sure that it doesn't have a bearing on athlete participation and athlete performance.
Amazing. Fantastic. Beautifully put and beautifully shared by you both. I wanted to also ask you, Cameron, how does it feel being a Black coach within acrobatic gymnastics, coaching Black athletes or athletes of color? And how does it feel being a Black judge?
I feel like I've said previously, the perception that people have of me often is not a result of my race, but it is always a factor. And I do look around and I look at all of the high-level coaches and all of the high-level judges, and there isn't that representation there. So I feel proud to be in this sphere, and I hope as a coach I can kind of elevate my athletes of color and advocate for them through my actions. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Is there something else that you would like to add, Jordan, to what I asked Cameron about, or do you both feel that there is anything else that you want to leave us with regarding this discussion around being a Black acrobat in acrobatic gymnastics?
I think in general, we feel like acro is this equalizer, where we think sports are an equalizer and anybody can do well if they work hard. But people don't take into account that race is a factor in every part of our life. So I think it's important to recognize that just because it may not be an overt issue, that it's still there, and it's still worth exploring, and it's still worth working to dismantle the systemic barriers.
Exactly. I think this has really just been an opportunity, an eye-opening opportunity for people to really step back and think about, the ways that all of the spheres in our lives that we navigate, how is this issue affecting the way that we are perceiving ourselves? How is it affecting our opportunities? And how is it affecting the opportunities of others? So I think just the fact that we are having these conversations now is really powerful. I might not have really consciously focused on all of these things when I was an athlete, but this has provided me with the opportunity to reflect on my experiences, maybe feelings that I had pushed down, and to really own those feelings and feel free to share them, but also feel the empowerment to know that you can advocate for yourself, and it doesn't have to be, well, that's just the way it is. That's how the system works. It's not something that you just have to sit back and take. You can raise your voice and say, here are some issues, and let's work together to dismantle them on a large scale.
Amazing. I wanted to thank you both, Cameron and Jordan, a beautiful sister duo, much like me and my sister Nicole. And I wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your experiences of what it was like to be a Black acrobat, now a Black coach, a Black judge, and then also, too, in hindsight, how you reflect on those experiences. This is powerful. Both of your voices matter. Thank you for continuing to advocate for Black acrobats within the acrobatic gymnastics community. We need you. We need you to continue to use your voices in a powerful way and to help to continue to encourage this conversation, keep it out in the open, keep people's ears open, and keep that dialogue flowing between coaches, between the organization, between the powers that be, on the grassroots level, boots on the ground. All aspects of those conversations matter, and I'm so proud of you both. I'm proud of your journeys. I'm proud of your careers, and I'm proud of the Black women that you are today. And so thank you so much for joining me on the show, and please take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for providing this opportunity. It's been great talking with you all about this.
You're welcome. Please take care, and until we speak next time, please stay safe and please stay healthy.
You too.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Listeners to hear just how complicated, how difficult, and how distressing it is to exist within a sport where the majority of the participants do not look like you, where the majority of the participants are not Black. You can hear within the experiences shared by these, even when we say brave, because this is day to day. That was these Black athletes' lives. That was their childhoods. And they are forever reminded of who they are in terms of their Blackness from their childhoods. You get to say, yes, I was excited, I competed in acro, I love acro, we all love acro. And then you get to have the other conversation about the painful experiences, about the inequality that you experienced, the injustice that you experienced. What Jordan Jones said about being able to look back now as an adult and look on experiences differently and take them in for the severity, for the weight that they hold now, even now in our lives, because sometimes it takes that time and space to be able to live more life, become even more aware, become even more in tune with yourself, because remember, we're all children navigating these very difficult experiences with adults that are also trying to navigate these experiences that are unique to them in some ways, but
in many ways are not unique to them, because most of our parents are Black and have experienced this racism in different areas of their lives. But we still love acro, and we still love our sport. And I love acro. I loved competing. I loved everything about it. Me and my sister did. We loved, my brother, he loved acro. We would spend hours practicing videos and routines, and our parents just couldn't get us to stop. We would be constantly learning choreography from other teams and doing them with one another and teaching each other, and we just would spend hours doing this, and we have so many good memories of that, because even with all of the racism that we did experience, and there was so much, and the continued racism that athletes and Black coaches and Black gym owners are now experiencing, you still can't take away the joy, the just natural enthusiasm and inspiration and exuberance that we have for the sport and how connected we feel to it. We did have powerful allies when I was competing as well. I had coaches, we had teammates, we had acro partners that were in our corner, that rallied for us, that I see with every single year of my life just how brave those individuals were way back then. And they were showing up even before they had me and my sister or my brother or our other acro partners that were women of color. And I am so encouraged by that, because I've always been so encouraged by that, because there were people in my life within the sport that would not settle for things being done against us in the name of our being Black. My next guest is former acrobatic gymnast Melanie Vaughn. She is a former junior elite acrobat who had the pleasure of being involved in acrobatics for 8 years. She spent the majority of her years under the coaching of Elena Arkelian and Danil Kostovetsky at Emilia's Acrobatics and Gymnastics Center. As an acrobat, Melanie had the opportunity to travel to the Netherlands and various competitions within the United States. She has been retired for 5 years, and now Melanie is pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse practitioner. Please welcome Melanie Vaughn to the show.
Hi, Mel. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. I want to start by honoring your journey as a Black acrobatic gymnast and recognizing that I feel this is such a powerful time to have this dialogue, as the acro community has never really heard the depth of the experience of what it is like competing in acrobatic gymnastics as a Black athlete. It's my intention that by hearing a variety of our Black experiences, that real fundamental change is instituted within the sport, and that these conversations will bring the community together even stronger and more supportive than before as we attempt to heal these wounds that have lasted for so long. I want to begin with an experience that you shared with me about competing while Black. Your most prominent memory of preparing for competition was making sure that you stayed out of the sun so that you didn't get darker, and that this would help you match the skin tone of your partners better. Can you speak to how this makes you feel now, looking back? How did it make you feel at the time? And how do you feel this is ingrained within the acrobatic gymnastics culture? And how did it feel competing as a Black athlete in acrobatic gymnastics?
Sure. Great question. I would say at the time, it didn't necessarily bother me as much as I feel it should have. And I think that was part of me just being naive and a child. I know that those are some things that I didn't necessarily feel super right about doing. And in some ways I felt guilty about not speaking up because had I said something to my parents or my mom specifically, she would have had a fit that was the way I was thinking. So I definitely think that there was something within me that knew that this wasn't necessarily a right way to behave, but for the sake of artistry, scores, and the sake of just looking more uniform with my non-Black team members and partners, I did what I had to be done. And it wasn't something that I was told to necessarily do. It was more so having watched other teammates that I look up to with Black people in their trios or pairs, seeing their seeing the members in their group get spray tans to match their color, and knowing that like my partners weren't necessarily going to do that, just kind of told me in my head that, okay, well then I need to do my part to make sure that I don't stand out necessarily. Looking back as an athlete, like in retrospect, when I kind of realized what was going on more, and felt, I guess, just more empowered as a Black person, going to college and just looking at it from a distance, I kind of felt ashamed by my actions, that I had to kind of be complicit in some ways with a system that was kind of racism. I mean, I feel like, and so I feel ashamed that I wasn't empowered enough to speak out at the time, and felt that was what I needed to do. But I also felt kind of hurt and pained that in a sport that I continue to just love and keep so close to my heart, I would get taken points off because the way I looked, the way my skin looked, something that I couldn't necessarily really control, was a factor that would kind of penalize me. And so that is a hurtful thing to come to terms with and think about. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. It did. Well, what did the consequences of speaking your truth feel like? How did you share your experiences while competing, or did you ever? I know you said that you didn't share some of those experiences with your mom, but did you share them with anyone? And did you feel like you had true allies in the sport while you competed?
So I would say, honestly, up until a week ago, or a couple days back, one of my teammates had messaged me because she wanted to know if I would be interested in possibly sharing kind of my experience as a Black athlete, and any type of racism I encountered. And at that time, I, of course, wanted to contribute because I think now, as you said, is such a powerful time. But I instantly replied to her, oh, I don't really know if I have anything to add along those lines. And then I was just like, just give me a little while to reflect. And so I think part of me kind of pushed those thoughts away in the beginning, but then, like, when I did really get to start thinking about it, I realized that a lot of the ways that I thought were kind of racism was kind of perpetuated in the sport was very covert and not as loud. And so with that said, I didn't really open up about it to anybody even once I first realized about the skin tone aspect of acro, until when my teammate just recently reached out to me this week. And she was like, I knew there was going to be something once you thought about it for a while. And this is a white peer. And so right now I do feel like she is definitely an ally, and we've had many talks about race, uncomfortable, comfortable, and all the above. But during that time, I wouldn't necessarily say I had an ally because I wasn't vocal to have that ally. And it wasn't really a conversation that was ever happening. And then I didn't speak up, I guess, more publicly until one of my fellow acromates at Extreme, Cameron, made a post about it. And that was also empowering to feel like someone so prominent in the sport was kind of breaking that glass down and saying what had been unsaid for so long. And so I commented on her post in terms of ways that acro kind of covertly perpetuates racism, whether it be just the inclusion of Black and brown people by making it such an expensive sport, to things as she spoke about, just leotard colors and having mesh that matches your skin tone. So, yeah, I feel like now is that time for me, and I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here now, so.
Yes, you're here now, and I wanted to ask, and thank you. That response was really beautiful and amazing, and I wanted to ask if you wanted to elaborate a little bit more on some of the covert ways in which racism exists within the sport of acrobatic gymnastics.
Sure. I feel like just off the top of my head, a couple, and some that I mentioned in the Facebook post I made was, one, just the fascination and praise surrounding a more Eurocentric physique in the sport of acro. I think that goes outside of racism, but I think in a lot of ways that also kind of perpetuates racism, just because I know for me, I have that stereotypical Black figure. I'm curvier, have a butt, and like those are things that I, regardless of me, trying to eat less, to diet more, all that stuff, they weren't going to go away. And I know that I was always worried of things like a weight deduction, when that really just should have never been a worry for me or so many other people in the sport. And I think that also took stepping away from the sport to realize, like, I'm not, yeah. But then I think also just, the uniformity that is kind of pushed on you all on all of us in the sport, seeing that it is a pretty heavily like white-dominated sport. When you say you need to look more uniform, like what are you really saying? What's the message under that? And why is there not beauty being found in all different shades, all different body types? And then, as I kind of briefly touched on, just the financial accessibility of the sport. It's incredibly expensive to get to those top levels in acro where you are on the national team, traveling the world, and just doing what you love on a bigger scale, I guess you would say. Whether it be paying for a leotard that's $1,000 because those are the ones that get the best artistry points, or even $700. Like, it's just not as inclusive of people who oftentimes do not have the capital or families do not have the capital to spend that. And oftentimes in Black communities and brown communities, due to systemic oppression and racism, there's huge disparities in wealth. So those are the communities who are typically less likely to be able to afford it. Although there are also, say, like white families and non-Black families who do struggle with affording acro. But just thinking in terms of ways that finances also is exclusive within the sport, and I think that kind of reflects in the demographics that we see at the higher levels as well.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Live Like an Acrobat. Please join me for part 2 of my conversation with Melanie Vaughn. Until then, please stay safe and stay healthy.